Private credit is a messed up game of musical chairs where you will be left without a seat at the end of it. We will start this story at a very different place that you expected, with Muhammad Said al-Sahaf. This gentleman is famous for his coined phrase, everything is okay in Baghdad. And essentially, he would say this as like the bombs were raining down behind him on his city, because that was his job, to make sure he strikes the confidence with the community, with the people around, and saying like, guys, everything is okay. We're not really in a civil war. Nothing is really happening. And a lot of people who I see today on the podcast, on the news, meeting with like prolific, folks like Steve Eisman, who I've spoken about in the past, who like discovered the whole issue around The Big Short, right, that you saw in the movie, played by Steve Carell. He was one of the first people to discover the fact that, like, hey, there's something going on with this, mortgage-backed securities. We should go investigate. Even people like him sit in front of individuals like this, talking about how everything is okay in private credit. For some of you, might be the question, what is private credit? To keep it very simple without going too much into jargon, essentially, private credit is just investment companies, primarily private equity companies, giving out loans to businesses. That's as kind of like complex as it gets. The difference between them or banks is really banks lending is very much regulated. They're required to keep certain amount of cash balance compared to the amount of money they lended because of the 2008 crisis, because we wanted to make sure they don't over-lever themselves. They won't put too much risk on their books and then just completely go down as an organization. Private equity does not have to follow those regulations. They're not banks. So they can go and lend and give out as much money to whoever they want, no matter how risky those loans are. And that story takes us to a very interesting announcement by White House, where essentially White House really start pushing this whole concept of democratizing access to the alternative investment in your 401ks. Like, this is a great thing for you. This is not. Primarily because of individuals like Mr. Steven Schwartzman and also similar individual Larry Fink. Both of them, essentially Larry Fink of BlackRock, Steven Schwartzman of Blackstone, both are very close to Trump, and they've been at least suggested as some of the individuals who've influenced the decision by the Trump's organization to allow 401k investment. And some people saw it as like, hey, this is a great thing. I can diversify my portfolio. I saw it as game of musical chairs. And these companies, BlackRock and Blackstone, looking for the suckers to offload their private credit exposure onto before everything collapses. And if you're wondering why I think so, BlackRock already faced limits on how many withdrawals they've approved. I think their exposure is like, I read through this article, like, I think 80 or something $billion. And protecting withdrawals, like restricting withdrawals, is not that unnatural of a thing, especially for the less liquid assets. But again, it shows you that individuals, the investors themselves, are a little bit scared. They are scared about the exposure they might have. They want to take their money back. And obviously for these companies like BlackRock, Blackstone, they need to find someone to offload those investments onto at the current price, and they cannot rush it, because then they'll have to do it at a discount, which means they would have to take a loss. They don't want to take a loss. They want to find someone to recognize that loss for them, and that's why they're restricting, in part because they can say, hey, our investment is not liquid. We cannot easily sell those assets, sell that debt, and acquire the money to go help you with the withdrawal. But at the same time, Blackstone is also like posting actual losses, and there are cracks in the system when it comes to those things. And that's where, when I saw that whole 401k announcement, I immediately thought that, okay, this is just them looking for someone to offload the investment to. You might ask, but why would they try to offload it? Like, what's the whole point? And that kind of like ties us back to the whole idea of the market to market. And the difference between like private equity, right, companies, is that all of the assets that they hold are private, right? So they don't have to disclose, in most of the cases, there are certain regulatory requirements for some parts, but like they don't have to disclose the financial performance of those companies, the quality of those assets, and they can keep them on the books as much as they can at the price that they decide, and investors invest in at that capitalization, without necessarily proving to the market that, hey, what I'm actually holding as an asset is worth it. I'm just saying it's worth this much, so you're going to have to pay me for this amount, or just go to the next investment shop. Where mark to market would happen if, say, it becomes a public company. So if you go public, you have to disclose all your financial performance. And so the market can assess now, honestly, how much your company actually valued, or at the sale, if you're selling it to someone who is actually going to, take out the magnifying glass and really will look closely at your business, they can also say if your business is worth or not worth what you're saying on the books. So as you can imagine, that creates certain incentives, right? Coming back to this whole conversation about finding that in the game of musical chairs, the sucker to leave without the chair, finding out ways to offload the investment, because for these companies currently, they can have complete dog pile of an asset, but as long as they pretend everything is okay in Baghdad, as long as they pretend that, hey, this asset is actually great, this is a great company, we paid $10 billion for it, this is an amazing $10 billion company, and they can keep saying it up until the point they find someone who is not intelligent enough, and they can offload that business to them, and they can say like, okay, now it's your asset, and you know what, it was actually a dog pile at the end of the day, but guess what, I charge my fees on 10 billion, I charge whatever my profit, if I had like some sort of like profit fee on top of it, I made my money, my investors are happy because I just gave them their money back, we're happy, who cares what happens with this company now? And this is where, if you think in the world of public market where it's going to be really scrutinized, other investment companies, which are not fools, they don't want to take your terrible assets from you, so they're going to heavily investigate them. The best place to go is 401ks, because guess what? Same companies and a few other investment companies like Fidelity, right? They decide what is the composition of the assets in your 401k, or at least in a few of those indexes that they offer to your company. And where you then kind of like have a small choice, but the really illusion of a choice of like picking a couple of funds that you allocate your 401k to. And you're kind of like at that point, hands off, they decide what the composition is. And they don't always tell you exact breakdown. Some companies do a better job than the others. But you can envision in this world where some of these companies that own your 401ks and also happen to have an exposure to private credit can say, you know what? Take some of these worse assets that we know are terrible, but we don't tell people that they're terrible because of we're not marking to market. Offload it to 401k, and then we can market to market at that point. And it's like, oh, I'm sorry, like guys, you lost a little bit of money. You lost like a quarter of your retirement. Oops, but I made my billions of dollars in the fees, so I'm cool. And you can say TohirT. That's a lot of speculation for those kind of things. Sure, but we had First Brands and Tricolor. Good examples of two companies. And again, I'll save the full story for another video, but the long story short of it, both companies pretty much went bankrupt, insolvent, shutting down, companies writing off the entire value of that investment. Funny enough, both companies were audited 3 or something like 4 months before complete crash, and both were rated like AAA, great status, amazing companies, best assets that we have in our private credit portfolio. Both companies crashed 3 months later. So it's not unsound speculation to say that there are more of these kind of assets sitting on their books today, and that is why there is a rush for them to find a sucker to offload these investments onto before people discover how terrible they truly are. And because finding those suckers, it takes actually time, right? 401ks will take time, and they finally got approved. There's some other ways I'm sure they're trying to come up with. There are a couple of ways I wanted to discuss with you to just give you examples of how like there is enough smoke in the room right now that there's definitely some sort of a fire, just we don't yet know the scale of that fire. So one of those methods that they start continuously developing, and private equity did it with other companies, not only private credit assets, and private credit assets primarily debt-based vehicles versus like private equity is more asset and full company ownership. But long story short, they came up with this concept of continuity funds. So the way continuity funds work is that I have fund number one, I buy all those assets, put them in a fund, right? And essentially, as we just discussed, maybe half of those assets are complete dog, whatever. Now I need to try to offload it. I cannot offload it. My maturation comes through. Basically, maybe I promised to my investors in this fund who gave me the money to buy those companies, I promised them I'm going to return them the money in the next 5 years. So 5 years pass by, they're getting anxious. They're like, hey, where's my money at? If you cannot find someone else to buy, which you can do as a company right now, private equity company, you create a new fund, fund number 2, for example, that acquires assets from fund number 1. You use the acquisition price, essentially, the amount of money you paid for fund 1, as the cash that's going to be dispersed to all of those investors, and you fund number two with another capital raise from other investors. So let me repeat this because I'm sure you start seeing some interesting notes here. You use the money from new investors to pay your old investors to keep maintaining the charade that this fund, this thing that you have, is actually worth something. Does it remind you of anything? Like anything, like pyramid shaped, maybe? That's a tool now, and it's been actively used, and it's keep being kind of like reused for some of these tougher to liquidate assets on their books. But even worst thing that I start to notice, and it came out kind of like recently, is that some of these companies, like private equity companies, they start acquiring insurance companies. And it's not completely new for like private equity to buy insurance companies, because insurance companies are cash cows, right? They're monthly fees that people are paying for their types of insurances. Private equity, they need that cash, especially because it gives them an opportunity to pay down the interest on the debt that they've acquired to kind of like fund some of their activities. So that's essentially what they're using. And they've been using them in the past, but now private credit companies are jumping on board, and they're saying like, hey, that's the same playbook. Let's go buy some of these insurance companies. Basically put at risk those companies, because they now become the cash cow for me to fund this amazing asset that I'm holding on hands right now, because I cannot sell it to anyone else. And I can only roll into the new fund so many times before new investors stop buying the idea of the continuity fund. So they're now leveraging additional financial tools to support this idea and keep that musical chair game going up until the point, again, they can find a sucker to hand it off to before they can go and actually say like, you know what, that was a terrible investment. And finally, this is where you also start hearing a lot more about, which I honestly just like this title of this article, the zombie pandemic in the PE. But yes, that's essentially what it turns into. You have a bunch of these funds that essentially, again, assets are terrible, that not good enough, to put it politically, for you to go public with them. Those assets are not good enough for other companies to buy them. You can only roll so many times your continuity funds or create evergreen funds, which concept we'll leave on the side, which similar idea. So you basically just keep these assets on your books. You don't mark them to market, because the benefit of keeping them on the books at the same price, you can still charge your 2% fee on the size of the fund for your company, and you can keep trying to find unique creative ways to offload all these terrible assets to someone else. And this is where, going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation with our friend Muhammad, I see those people as such. I see them going on these shows right now and all saying like, no, don't, like people panicking. It's just they're uneducated investors. We've acquired a lot of retail investors. They're just not educated enough in holding on to these long-term assets. We used to work with pension funds. We used to work with these high net worth individuals, family offices. They understand the exposure on the liquidity, and they understand that if they give me billions of their dollars, I'm going to hold on to it for the next 5 to 7 years. Sure, that's fair. But where in parallel, as you say this, and as you say like, yeah, we've attracted a bunch of these retail investors, you did not properly educate them in some cases. And you probably did, but you just promised them like, guys, this is going to be great. You're going to make so much money with us. You did that. We look at the economy. We see the lack of decent IPOs happening through. We don't see other companies acquiring companies from your portfolio. Again, can we prove without having access to all of your information that you're sitting on just like a pile of rubbish right now? Sure, no. But are we, smelling the stench in the air? Abso-freaking-lutely. This is why, the world is round, but it's sometimes rounder for some other people, and those are the people who are trying to act like it's rounder for them. It's like, oh no, as long as I can get away with this charade, and there's going to be people out there who are interested in my success because they either want to work with me, or they want to get a portion of the fee, or they have some other, monetary interest in the partnership with me. They're going to keep playing this shell of a game, and they keep going on all of these media outlets and telling people how everything is okay with private credit, nothing is crashing. And it's going to keep happening up until the point, as I said, they find a sucker, they find someone to grab the chair off of in this messed up game of musical chairs. And at that point, they're going to be like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to write a book about how terrible those assets were, and going to make more money off of that as well. So, interesting situation. We'll see what's going to happen in this, but if there's one thing I'm going to leave you with, don't let any of those alternative assets into your 401k. At least let's do that. That's definitely in your control. You cannot control everything else in this story, but at least you can control that sliver of item. And even then, so many of these companies have very likely much bigger exposure, including the banks themselves who've been lending to private credit companies. So even the banks are currently exposed and they're writing down their books because of these assets going bad. Not a financial advice, but I have less and less trust right now in the public market. And so even your 401k that doesn't have alternative assets but still exposed to public market can be negatively exposed if this whole thing implodes. So transparently, again, not a financial advice, I pulled all of my money out of the public markets several months ago now. Yes, sure, I missed on some of the upside on some of the stocks, but you know what? At least I have a peace of mind that when this whole, again, the music stops in this game of musical chairs, at least I know I have maybe smaller than planned, but I have my chair. I'll see you next Saturday.